The Ford Everest in Malaysia has one job, and that is to give the Toyota Fortuner a headache. And that's because in the row of body-on-frame SUVs, there are only two. But at over 300,000 ringgit for this flagship Everest Titanium, is it really going to be a headache for the Fortuner? Or is this the car that everybody is overlooking but really shouldn't? My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, and before we get into this review, be sure to hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified every time we make a new upload. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our review of the 2023 Ford Everest. Now, when it comes to the Everest, there are two main things that set this SUV apart from everything else. Number one is the looks, because as you can see, this is a very assertive, very bold, very American design with a bluff front end, which is framed by these C-clamp LED daytime running lights, which on this Everest Titanium hide the performance LED matrix LED headlights up front. And because this is the flagship Everest, you get a lot of chrome and more chrome down there, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that you can tell from here is the fact that because it's a body-on-frame SUV, it is very tall. Compared to other SUVs within the 300,000 ringgit segment, such as the Mercedes-Benz GLA, for example, or the BMW X1, or actually quite a number of X3s, you can tell the Everest is a larger car. This sits taller, wider, and longer than the majority of its counterparts within this segment, and it also manages to eclipse the Fortuner. Now, before I get on with the rest of the design, I'd like to talk about the second differentiator with the Everest, and that is the engine. Because compared to the Fortuner, which can be had with either a 2.8 litre turbo diesel or a 2.7 litre petrol, the Everest can only be had in a 2 litre 4-cylinder bi-turbo diesel, which produces in excess of 200 horsepower and 500 Newton meters of torque, with power going to all four wheels via a selectable all-wheel drive system and a 10-speed automatic gearbox. Now, that gearbox is important because this vehicle produces its peak torque between 1,750 RPM to 2,000 RPM. That's right, your torque band is very narrow, so thank God it has a ton of gears. And down the side, we go back to the original point, which is the fact that this is a very bold and muscular SUV. You can tell that by the flared arches, front and rear, the enormous 20-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Goodyear Wrangler highway terrain tires, which are the correct sort of tires for this sort of car, and I don't care what you have to say about it. Down the side, you'll find this little vent that says bi-turbo to let you know that you have the vehicle with two turbos, because if you buy the Everest Sport, it only comes with one turbo, but the Trend and this, the Titanium, have two turbos, so more power, more torque. And in case you want further differentiation from the more plebeian models, you also get titanium script written here. I do appreciate the fact that this car is very blocky, because when you buy a large SUV, you often want it to be relatively assertive on the road, and there is no denying that the Everest certainly has presence. I love this blocky shape. I love how assertive it is, and I appreciate the side steps because I'm not very tall, and so without this, it is quite a bit of a clamber to get in the car. But the rear, I think, is where the Everest looks most cool to me. And that is largely down to these taillights, which are full LED, of course, but also have a very interesting design to them, and this clear Perspex casing also encases the Everest badge that stretches across the tailgate. Now, as you can tell, again, this is a very tall vehicle, which means when you do open the boot, you will notice that there is quite a lip to get things in and out of. So if you have an old dog, you might need a step stool to get him in and out. And if you have a dog, you may realize that right now there isn't really that much space with all three seats up, because admittedly this is relatively small, but it is on par with other three-row SUVs, be it ladder, body on frame or not. However, one of the things that the Everest can do that others cannot is this, because with the press of a couple of buttons in the titanium model, you can fold the rear seat flat electronically, which means you now have acres of space, but you don't have a parcel shelf, which means if you're trying to hide something back here, good luck with that. And of course, if you are trying to load people back here and you realize, oh no, I need 7 seats, all you have to do is press those 2 buttons and up they come. The only other car I've seen that offers this in this sort of configuration is the Land Rover Discovery, which is 3 times more expensive. So doesn't seem like that bad value all of a sudden, does it? Now, underneath the boot floor, you will find tools and a little bit of space for, you know, dirty shoes and stuff like that. And if you're looking for a spare tire, you will find it underneath the vehicle. But the most important part that I'm sure all of you are wondering right now is, yes, the Everest is very large and very bold and very American, but does that interior justify the 300,000 ringgit price tag? And on the surface, it does pretty much okay. So for this particular model, we get a 12-inch portrait-style Sync 4 infotainment system, which is the very latest and greatest infotainment system from Ford, and it does look pretty good, if you ask me. It's bright, it's punchy, the graphics are fantastic, it is very responsive, and like I said, everything is exactly as you expect it to be. I apologize because that was a little bit of Tracy Chapman. Now, the bit about this system that I appreciate is the fact that you still maintain physical buttons for the air conditioning. So you have 2 dials on either side to handle your temperature, you still have buttons for your fan speed, and so on. I appreciate this because it's tactile. It's very easy for you to figure out what temperature you want or to adjust your fan speed and so on. But what I find a bit weird is that all of these inputs are duplicated onto the bottom half of the screen, a little bit like the Mercedes-Benz MBUX system. But at least it's there, so you have a choice, I guess. Now, in front of me sits another 12-inch screen on this titanium model, which provides all of my usual heads-up display nonsense, such as my speed, my engine speed, my trip info, and so on. But what I appreciate is the fact that because Americans are into slightly more gimmicky things, the graphics on this are fantastic. I'm made to understand that Ford has actually worked with several game developers, if I recall correctly, in order to develop some of the graphics in this car. Was that the Hummer? I don't know, one of these American brands did it. And as such, it does mean that a lot of these cars now get a bit more in terms of visual trickery, which I think that for buyers looking at a vehicle like this, they may be swayed by this sort of thing, and I wouldn't really blame them. Now, aside from that, like I said, everything here looks relatively upmarket. You have an electronic shift lever, you have a lot of leather covering most of the materials that you touch. Everything is relatively soft, including the top part of the dash, and these seats seem relatively comfortable as well. But it's when you start inspecting a little bit further that things start looking a little bit ridiculous. So for starters, these 2 front seats are electrically adjustable, but there is no memory. On top of that, the seat base can only be adjusted for height and not for tilt, which is annoying. Your cup holders, which deploy from the dashboard, feel a little bit chintzy. This top-mounted glove box, the button of which feels like something you get from Daiso. And then worst of all, the most offensive part is actually the buttons on the steering wheel, because one could argue that a lot of these things you won't interact with. I'll give you that much. But the trouble is that the buttons on the steering wheel are things that you're going to be interacting with a lot. And unfortunately, they do not feel very satisfying to use at all. They feel a bit cheap, they feel a bit under-engineered. And the annoying thing is I've gotten better button tactility from BYD. Moving on, there are more buttons in the center console. So you have a drive mode selector here, which allows you to choose between the car's drive modes, which is Eco, Normal, Sport, and Off-Road. And then in the middle of the dial, you will find 3 buttons that allow you to change the various gear ratios. So you have 2 high, 4 high, and 4 low. 4 low, obviously, for you to do some more serious off-roading and so on. You also have a button down here that puts it into the more serious drive mode. This is the off-road drive mode selector, which allows you to choose between things like mud and ruts, Baja mode, and so on. Oh no, wait, this car doesn't come with Baja, it comes with sand mode instead. So again, it would be quite difficult to get your Everest stuck. Now, because it's a very large car and it is designed somewhat to be a family car, this is relatively practical. So again, you have the Daiso button accessible top mounted gear glove box here. You have another glove box down here, which is relatively large, but the operation of which isn't really very inspiring. You have a wireless charger here, a couple of cup holders. You have a French fry holder in front of the gear lever. I'm not kidding, there's even a graphic with some French fries in it. You get a relatively large center console with a removable storage piece here with a 12-volt socket in there as well. You get USB-C, USB-A, relatively large door bins. And overall, it seems that there is certainly enough space to keep and hide your tat. However, in the rear, it seems, on the surface at least, a little bit more shortchanged. So for starters, there's not really anything to play with back here aside from the fan speed controller down here, which is certainly very nice because it allows you to control the air conditioning blowers that blow from the ceiling, which I certainly appreciate. You also have the lock and unlock buttons here, which I think is actually quite novel. I've never seen this on any other car, and so it would mean that, for example, adolescent children can be left in the car while parents go out and get groceries or whatever, because adolescents always want to be left alone. And you do get USB ports. You get a USB-C and a USB-A back here, as well as a 3-pin 230-volt socket. This is really interesting because it means that, theoretically, you could plug in a extension cable and you could charge several devices back here. So for example, if you have 2 children mounted in the ISOFIX mounts, they could have a Nintendo Switch each and they could amuse themselves for a long drive all the way back to Kelantan, if heaven forbid you have to go all the way back there. But in terms of actual accommodation for people, it's a little bit interesting because, as you can see, I have plenty of kneeroom and plenty of headroom despite the large panoramic sunroof, but unless I stretch out like this, I don't really have much in the way of under-thigh support. These seats appear to be mounted quite low to the floor, which means if I sit like this, I don't really have that much under-thigh support. Now, if I were to move this seat a little bit further forward in order to make room for the third row, although actually there was plenty of room back there anyway, if I was to be sat like this, I really don't have that much in terms of support. And these seats in the front are also not mounted that high up, which means my ability to tuck my feet in underneath is still relatively hampered. That said, however, at least I appreciate the fact that I have bottle holders here, I have an armrest here with more cup holders, which are deployable in a more elaborate mechanism than what you get from Porsche. And overall, it's not bad back here. Life in the third row is actually not that bad. So yes, the seats are mounted very low, and once again I have very little under-thigh support, but generally 3-row SUVs, body on frame or not, are kind of like this. And for what it's worth, these seats are relatively well padded. I have huge windows for me to look out of, and most importantly, I have aircon vents that can blow air right at my face, which means even sat back here, I shouldn't overheat. That said, however, these back seats are made for smaller children or adolescents at best, because adults would not be comfortable back here for any more than about an hour. That said, there are also no ISOFIX mounts, which means if you have even smaller children, they have to live in the second row, not in the third row, which is probably for the better anyway. But enough about that. The Everest has been, in this generation, updated in order to be more premium, more posh, more upmarket. And according to Ford, an especial amount of care was made to ensure this car is now quieter and more refined than ever before. And in order to do that, I need to be back in the front seat, where hopefully I'll have a slightly more comfortable place to put my legs. Now, before I get into what it's like to drive and live with the Everest, I have to first provide a little bit of context when it comes to these ladder frame SUVs. Now, for the most of us, we all drive vehicles that are given a monocoque construction, where the body and the chassis are one and the same. Now, the benefits of a monocoque construction are very simple. It makes the car lighter, it makes it more rigid, it means that there are less vibrations, or fewer vibrations through the cabin, and overall, it results in a more refined, more efficient package. Now, the thing about ladder frame vehicles, like almost all pickup trucks, and SUVs like this, and vans and so on, is that number one, they are tougher, which means that they can take a lot more abuse. Secondly, they usually tend to be much better in terms of towing because you can pull more because you're holding on to that frame rather than a softer monocoque chassis. But of course, the downside to that is most body-on-frame vehicles are very heavy, and the Everest is no different. So, in many regards, I got into this expecting a slightly less refined experience because, after all, this is ultimately an SUV that's based on a truck, and trucks are not exactly known for being particularly refined or comfortable. But I'm happy to say that I'm quite surprised, because this diesel Everest is actually more refined than I expected it to be, and in fact it's more refined than a diesel BMW that I drive from time to time. The engine feels like it's very far away and it's very, very isolated from the cabin, so much so that you only really notice it when you're starting it up or when you're on pretty heavy throttle. Otherwise, it remains muted and, like I said, a distant thing. On top of that, when you pair that with the 10-speed automatic transmission, it does mean that this car's relatively narrow torque band is utilized more often, because this gearbox does a very good job at making sure that you are always right where the torque is. The other benefit, obviously, as you might have just seen, is that when you drive something this big with nice big cushy tires, you don't really pay much attention to potholes, which is quite refreshing. Now, some of you may think that this Everest, being powered by a twin-turbo diesel offering 210 PS and 500 Nm of torque, is fast. And I understand where that assumption would come from, because, 500 Nm is not something to be scoffed at. In fact, that's about as much torque as producing a 3-litre Toyota Supra. But fast is not the word I'd use to describe the Everest. Instead, the engine and gearbox pairing appear to be set up in a far more relaxed fashion, the idea being that this should be a suitable day-to-day, even town driver for that matter. And to some extent, that is what this car has proven to be, because driving in town, this gearbox has, like I mentioned earlier, always picked the right ratio, always kept me in the torque band, and overall, it's been relatively painless. One of the other aspects that's made this particularly painless is the fact that the steering system in this truck, because ultimately it is a truck, is one of the most familiar and friendly systems I've encountered in a vehicle of this sort. Now, those of you who follow me on social media will know that I complained a little while back, after having driven, I think, 2 or 3 pickup trucks back to back, that my arms were getting very sore and it was getting very tiring to have to turn the wheel so many times, usually over something very heavy, in order to get it through, for example, my condo car park. But this Everest has proven to be no more difficult than driving anything else. The steering wheel is very light, although it remains quite accurate. It weights up very naturally at speed, and it's never been a handful, even though this is a very, very large SUV. Now, when you take that into account with the refinement that I mentioned earlier, it does mean that the Everest stacks up as a pretty good daily driver, a pretty good family car, if you would. And that does extend somewhat to experience out on the motorway. Because when you're driving at speed, when you're cruising, for example, to do many, many motorway miles, to cover great distances and so on, the Everest does prove to be a pretty great partner. That large and heady amount of torque means that overtaking is done very easily. You don't have to be concerned with hills and so on, because this truck has so much torque that you'll never really need to kick down more than 2 or 3 gears, although the gearbox will do that for you. And it means that progress is pretty much relentless. And then there's the added aspect of this car's safety technology, because the Everest Titanium that we're in today has the full gamut of active safety systems from Ford. So that means that you have adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, a fantastic 360-degree camera, and all that other nonsense. It also has automated parking, which I'll get into a little bit later. But what that means is when you're on the motorway, you can set the cruise control to 110 kilometers an hour and the car will do all the work for you. And if you find yourself in traffic jam, the ADAS system in this car seems to be pretty adept at that too, maintaining a relatively reasonable distance, even with our drivers and their insistence of driving way too close to each other and cutting into every possible gap. And so this means that driving the Everest over the last 4 days has been painless, completely painless. But it's out on the motorway where I have to start to touch on the things I don't particularly like about the Everest. So number one, while the engine is very refined and there is actually very little in terms of wind noise, you do get quite a bit of road roar into the cabin, particularly when you start to creep over 120, which means that if you're looking at this and thinking, yes, I can do KL Penang or JB Penang or JB Kedah on a regular basis and do 150 kilometers an hour, you shouldn't. But I could do that efficiently with this 2-liter turbo diesel and cruise at ridiculously high speeds. Yeah, well, that's not really going to be the case. This is an SUV that is made, again, primarily for comfort. It's not really made for speeding, which means you would be better suited in, for example, a diesel BMW, like the kind I drive on a regular basis. But that's only one aspect to the things I don't like. The other thing that I don't particularly appreciate is the fact that these seats, while they are very comfortable, there are two aspects which I think they are quite lacking. Number one, there's very little in terms of lateral support, which I suspect is mostly to accommodate American buyers who tend to be very wide, and so they don't like being held into their seats too much. And so these seats lack side bolstering, which is a little bit unsettling, particularly when you're going around corners. Something this tall, for example, has the ability to chuck you around quite a bit when you're going through corners and the like. And so it would have been nice if the seats did a slightly better job at holding me in place. The other problem I have is the fact that ultimately this Everest Titanium is a 300,000 ringgit SUV, which means you expect certain other niceties from the seats. For example, seat ventilation, which I don't have, and memory functionality for both the front seats, which again, I don't have. So while the technology in here certainly looks great, and believe me, the graphics in this thing are fantastic. It puts anything else from Toyota and Mitsubishi and so on to shame. Nothing comes close. You have to go into a proper premium car to get this sort of experience. I'd like some more niceties, please, for my 300,000 ringgit. But overall, it's been really great. And then you get into the technology, like I mentioned earlier. You have that parking assistant, which can get you in and out of parallel spaces, and it does so very, very well, if you ask me. And it does help when you're driving something this big, particularly if you're not too familiar with it, like me. And then you have the adaptive high beams, which means that if you traverse difficult terrain at night, if you're taking back roads and so on, this truck will ensure that you will always be able to see very far ahead of you very clearly, which is certainly something that I appreciate. And then there's the fact that the ADAS systems work in a very car-like manner. If you've ever driven a Toyota Hilux with lane keep assist, you'll know that it manages to keep the truck in lane by braking the inner wheel. You don't get that in this. Instead, it adjusts via the steering wheel, which is what you'd expect from a passenger car. And it's certainly, again, something that I appreciate in the Everest because it does make it feel a little bit more like a passenger car. But the big question, which I think a lot of people asked both when this car was launched and also now, is does it justify its 300,000 ringgit price tag? Well, in many ways, I think that it does, because you do have what I think is one of the best diesel engines currently available on the market. You do have a very capable all-wheel drive system because the Everest has always been capable off-road, and this one is no different. And you get more space in here, it's more refined, it's more practical, it's built to a higher standard than what we've expected of Fords in the past. So overall, to me, it does seem like Ford is being quite serious with its 300,000 ringgit price tag. However, if you're thinking that this is a competitor to vehicles like the Mazda CX-9 or indeed the Kia Sorento, then maybe not. Because admittedly, for passengers, this is not quite as comfortable an experience as those monocoque chassis SUVs that I mentioned earlier. Furthermore, the CX-9 is available with a turbo petrol engine, which is going to be slightly less rattly than this, and it also has quite a nice note when you floor it, although it does consume a hell of a lot more fuel, whereas this has quite happily done about 9 liters per 100 kilometers, which is quite impressive for something this big. But if you're looking at a 3-row ladder on, or rather body-on-frame SUV, a ladder chassis SUV like the Toyota Fortuner or even the Toyota Prado, if you're looking at recon vehicles, then you should really give the Ford Everest a consideration, because on top of having proper after-sales support and a proper warranty backed by the manufacturer, you also get what is undoubtedly one of the most sophisticated vehicles that Ford has ever produced for our market. It's very clear to me that Ford is on an upwards trajectory. They see themselves as being more than a mass market brand. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if in the very near future they pivot to becoming something of a mass premium brand, like Volkswagen. Because this Everest, like I said, is very good. Very, very good. And hand on heart, if I had 300,000 ringgit to spend today on a car, I would take a very long and hard look at the Ford Everest, because this is a surprisingly good truck. It's great to look at, it's great to sit in. I love the technology. And although, yes, there are little issues here and there, the fact that the Everest looks like nothing else out there and it presents itself in such a unique way means that I'm willing to forgive a lot. And while I said I'm willing to forgive a lot, there really isn't that much to forgive because, again, this is a bloody good truck. In any case, that's been our review, many years coming, of the 2023 Ford Everest Titanium. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to get notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.